Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to BPC, those of you who are here, and hello to everyone in TV land and virtual land. It's such a luxury to be able to drink your coffee and plug into the Zoom and learn something. I'm Margaret Spellings. I get to be the president and CEO of the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we at BPC are keeping the flame of bipartisanship lit around lots of things, and contrary to what you might see and read, there's a lot of that still under the hood in Washington, and we're a big part of it. So last year, as you know, the Supreme Court overturned Chevron deference, which means that the courts are, it's now an open question as to how much deference the courts will give regulatory agencies as they implement laws. At BPC, we saw this as a way to build on the work that we've been engaged in here at BPC for a long time, known colloquially as Fix Congress, although we don't subscribe completely to that, because we know a lot of people are doing great work there, and you're going to meet one of them right now. But we thought this was an opportunity to really talk about the role that Congress plays long before the election. And so we've set ourselves to assemble a terrific group of people and thinkers that could take a look at this and what the implications were for legislators, for regulators, and for the courts. So we've worked closely with a lot of experts in and out of government, and we pulled together a group of smart people. So we have a report today that we're releasing from the Working Group on Congress, Courts, and Administrative Law, which began last fall. And today we're going to hear from the two co-chairs, the fantastic co-chairs, former Senators Heitkamp and Martinez. I also want to thank former Senator Roy Blunt, who is an executive fellow of ours at the BPC, who keeps us on track in a lot of different ways, including this, and for his stewardship of this group. And I want to recognize a couple of the working group members who are here with us this morning, Susan Dudley and Kurt Couchman. And I also want to recognize, there you are, I can't see much out there, Secretary Jean Scalia, who was with us this morning as well, who was a good shepherd for us along the way. Before we hear from the working group co-chairs, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Congressman Joe Morelle to say a few words. He is the ranking member and who has represented the New York 25th District in upstate New York. And he's the ranking member of the House Committee on House Administration, which has jurisdiction over laws related to federal elections. He's thought a lot about these issues, and we look forward to partnering with him on the role that Article 1 plays in these important discussions. He's also the vice-ranking member of the Committee on Appropriations. So thank you, Congressman, for being with us today and for sharing your thoughts. We know you have a busy schedule, so thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you. Good morning. And thank you, everyone, for joining in this great event. I do apologize that I'm going to have to run for votes because I would very much love to hear our senators talk about the working group and the work they've done, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to chat after this event as we begin to implement, hopefully, many of the recommendations that they make. Thank you, Margaret, not only for that kind introduction, but for all the work that you do and for the important work that the Bipartisan Policy Center does. This is no time, do I think, certainly in the last 150 years, where bipartisanship is so important. And I think you're right, there's more of it that happens than people recognize. But as Senator Martinez said, and I were chatting, talking a little bit about the impact of social media. I was at a dinner last night with a great friend, Nick Langworthy, who represents a district adjacent to mine in upstate New York, Republican. We have a great relationship, and we were discussing the impact of social media, that it's not as though CNN or MSNBC or Fox News is going to have a headline that says, members get along and accomplish things. So it's a little bit of a challenge. But I want to just express my thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Fix Congress cohort, who have been great partners in the work that we do on House administration and our modernization subcommittee, which is led by my dear friend Stephanie Bice out of Oklahoma, in an act of bipartisanship. That subcommittee has equal members of Democrats and Republicans, and I'm looking forward to our continued partnership as we work in the months and years ahead. I have proudly served Rochester, New York, in upstate New York since the early 1980s. I hate to say this with members of the press here, but I've been in elective office for 41 straight years, starting as a county legislator. I served in the New York State Legislature for many years, the last 6 as the majority leader of the State Assembly, and now have the privilege of representing my community here in Congress. So along the way, I've learned a little bit, particularly in the state legislature, about the importance and how you draft laws, make policy, and how important subject matter experts are to both writing and implementing laws and government programs, particularly in a moment where there is so much expertise, so much niche policy knowledge that you have to have in a very complicated world and in a very complicated government. So I will admit, when I first came to Congress, I was a little surprised at how vague, in some ways, the statutes we passed and how deferential the work that Congress did to the executive branch. So I was more used to, although I don't want to overstate my importance, but when I wrote laws in New York with staff, with policy matter experts, they were more detailed than some of the laws that I saw passed in Congress. So I thought that was curious. And you do need, however, to strike a balance between Congress's prerogatives and, of course, the executive branch's regulatory and rulemaking functions. And unfortunately, given what has happened last year, that balance is no longer the appropriate place. In the Loper Bright case, the Supreme Court essentially sidelined subject matter expertise at federal agencies, overturning 40 years, as you all know, of precedent and eliminating the Chevron deference. But this has forever, in my view, upended how Congress writes laws and interacts with federal agencies to implement the laws that we pass. And I feel strongly, as I'm sure many do, that the now defunct standard that was set forth in Chevron helped to facilitate that appropriate balance and facilitated accountability in government. It represented the simple idea that Congress and the members of Congress chosen directly by the people and the executive branch elected through presidential elections should be the primary policymakers because they're accountable to the people in that way and not the courts. The Loper Bright decision hasn't empowered Congress. Instead, it has, in effect, given the judiciary, and this is an important point that we need to understand, it's really empowered the judiciary and given them exclusive power over virtually every open policy issue, regardless of how expertise-driven that issue may be in without taking into account the will of the voters as expressed through the Congress and through the executive branch. Beyond accountability, Chevron simply made sense because agencies generally have greater and more detailed subject matter expertise and staff capacity than Congress does, and that's something I'm sure that we will be talking about and something I want to touch on in the next couple of minutes. Certainly has more capacity than Congress, but it has more capacity than the courts do as well. And I want to associate myself with what Justice Kagan's dissent, she characterized the majority's opinion as a judicial power grab and described the justification for overruling the 4 decades of precedent. And she said, and I quote, "Courts must have more say over regulation, necessarily, over the provision of health care, the protection of the environment, the safety of consumer products, the efficacy of transportation systems, and so on. A long-standing precedent at the crux of administrative governance thus falls victim to a bald assertion of judicial authority. The majority disdains restraint and grasps for power." Now, as much as I and maybe people in this room and people online watching don't agree with the court's decision, in that regard, I analogize things like this to gravity. I might not love it, but I recognize that it exists. So the question is, in the world we live in, this is the new order, this is the new framework, so we have to adapt. The question is how to do that. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir of people in this room and people tuning in that would say Congress needs to get serious about investing in itself if we're going to carry out this important work. So it's up to us, those of us privileged to work on the Hill in whatever capacity that is, to make sure that the first branch of government has the expertise, the infrastructure, and the capacity to legislate with far more specificity than has been the case before. But our collective refusal to spend enough money on our institution makes it a serious challenge to the members and staff to get into the weeds of issues and to lead the regulatory process. This is a point I raise often. I raised it during the Committee on House Administration has this rather strange but interesting power that we give and okay the budgets for all the other standing committees with the exception of appropriations. So as all those members were coming in front of us, I would repeatedly ask the question as it relates to Chevron and the decision in Loper Bright, whether we have the capacity to do our oversight and to dispense our legislative authority. People on either side of the aisle can agree, and we all do, about the size and the breadth of government, what we should be doing, and we disagree about rulemaking and regulation and how that should go. But I would hope that people would join together and recognize that the power must rest with Congress and the executive agencies, not the courts. And so if I'm blessed at some point to be the chairman instead of the ranking member of the Committee on House Administration in a few years, and as a member of the Appropriations Committee, I'm going to make it my mission to ensure Congress has both the authority and the capacity to hire more technical staff and legislative councils. And I know that I'm short on time. I'll just say a few additional words, if I may. I asked the chair for another 30 seconds, I think, I'm not sure it'll be 30 seconds, but we also need to work and identify an institutional body to take on the obligations associated with rulemaking and implementation that for decades was within the purview of the executive agency, and that's going to be Congress. So as we embark on the next fiscal year, and I think it's vital for our appropriators to understand that the failure to invest in Congress will hinder our ability to fill that void left by this decision. And I know people in the room all join with me in recognizing that we lost a tireless advocate in Derek Kilmer, who's a dear friend and did so much to advance the cause, both of bipartisanship and the institution of Congress. And I remember Derek and I talking many times about this and my making a pledge to him that I would at least be one of the voices that helps fill the void of his leaving. So I'm going to continue to fight for funding in the legislative branch and to make sure that the Office of Legislative Counsel, Congressional Research Service, and Government Publishing Office, and others have the resources to do their job. As Margaret mentioned, I'm on the Appropriations Committee. I'm the vice ranker. I told them I'd rather be the viceroy, but they didn't have that position open. But we're going to continue. Look, I think the continuing resolution, which cut funding for the modernization initiatives account by 80%, those are opportunities for us to continue to look at using tools like AI and other expert tools to make sure that we're doing our job. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the working group and the recommendations you make. We are partners in this. We must be. And I sort of think about it like this. You know, the courts have given us this. It is our responsibility to do it. Now, some people may be cynical and think what they recognize is Congress is difficult. It's nearly impossible to do anything. We haven't passed appropriation bills on time in both houses, maybe once in the last 25 years. Are we going to have the expertise, the time, the capacity, the patience, the ability to get this done? But we need to. We must. It's our responsibility as Article 1 to make sure this happens. So I'm grateful for the invitation to be here. I'm sorry I can't stick around because I'd much rather hear from the senators on this and thank them for their long service to this country and their continued service in capacities after their time in the Senate. But I'm really looking forward to working with you and making sure as we move forward we make the best of what I think was a bad decision, but to empower us to do the work that we need to do. So thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. God bless you all.
All right, thank you. That's a great table setter, Congressman, and we appreciate you being here. All right, let me find where I'm supposed to be. Okay, all right. We are so fortunate, as I mentioned, to have two former senators who chaired this effort. Former Senator Heidi Heitkamp, former Senator Mel Martinez, who co-chaired our working group. Senator Heitkamp represented North Dakota in the U.S. Senate from 2013 to 2019, and since January of 23, she has served as the director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, and a lot of us enjoy seeing her and her commentary on various media platforms. So, Senator, thanks for keeping up with all of that. Senator Mel Martinez, my friend, represented Florida in the U.S. Senate from 2005 to 2009 and served prior to that as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development from 01 to 04. And he continues to be involved in these issues as he sits on the board of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate. Senators, we are grateful to you, to our task force members, to the guidance of Senator Roy Blunt, to Susan Dudley and Kurt Couchman, who are here with us today. Today, the working group released its report and recommendations, and so I would ask the two senators to come join me here on the stage for a conversation. And yes, the podium is moving out of the way. Mel, you're in the middle, the rose between the thorns and all of that. You lucky dog. Yes, yes.
Rare treat.
Yeah. I know, right. It's made you the great man you are today, to be around so many wonderful women. All right, I want to flash our little report, but this can be found online, and I know you policy nerds will enjoy reading it as we do. Senator Heitkamp, I want to start with you. With this relevant Supreme Court decision, the court obviously did away with Chevron deference. Top line, what does this mean for the Congress?
Well, I think there's a whole spectrum of thought about this. Some people say that the court had already diminished this to the degree that it's not as earth-shattering, to the point that the sky is falling and we no longer have any certainty in regulation. The truth always, as we believe, moderates, is somewhere in the middle. But the most important thing, and the reason why I wanted to engage in this process, is because it's a wake-up call for the United States Congress to do their job. And I think the frustration that I had, and you heard the congressman earlier talking about those of us who came from state government who saw a very engaged legislative process, a very, expertise being applied, that you don't see that as much in Congress. And certainly I didn't see it because regular order was not a thing where you developed committee expertise. And so I was thrilled to be asked, Margaret, to be part of this, because when I was in the Senate, I worked with Rob Portman to talk about, when this was just that's going to happen out there. Let's prepare for it already in legislation. Amend the Agencies Practice Act or the Administrative Agencies Practice Act. Let's do all the things that would prepare. But Congress doesn't do anything unless it's forced to do things. And so I think that this opportunity to present some insights, to kind of try and come up with a consensus product that can move forward, to reassert Article 1 responsibility, and to bring expertise back to the Congress was just a wonderful opportunity for somebody who has worked on regulatory reform in state government and really in Congress, making it a priority for me when I was there.
Senator, you obviously have served as a regulator and as a member of the legislative branch. How do you see this? You no doubt promulgated lots of regulations in your time at HUD.
So, having been on both sides of the table, if you will, I have to say that the unfortunate part about the regulatory world we've lived in is that too often it drifts downward. It's not done by the appointed Senate-confirmed person, but it's really delegated to some person in the bureaucracy, with all respect to the bureaucracy that it deserves, because there's a lot of very talented, well-intended people. It really does drift way down, and a lot of times the policy is substituted not by what may have been meant by Congress, but by the policy preferences of the writer of the regulation. And those sometimes can be consistent with what Congress may have wanted, but a lot of times they may not be. And so that uncertainty falls back on the legislative branch and Article 1 responsibility to say what you mean and say it with clarity, so that then it eliminates the opportunity for some unelected person, well-intended as they may be, competent as they may be, to really be enacting law in a way that isn't really what the framework of our constitutional system was intended to be. So that's kind of my observation. And I think in a better world, I agree with the Loper-Bright decision, because I do think that it falls back upon the Congress to be more precise and demand more of itself in the way that it legislates, so that it leaves less room for there to be prerogatives then exercised by the executive branch in ways that it was not ever intended.
So for both of you, and Senator, you mentioned regular order. You know, we've come in a history where there was a lot of, building blocks. I mean, I remember No Child Left Behind, we spent 6 weeks on the Senate floor debating that law with hundreds of amendments and so forth. So talk about that trajectory that we've been on from kind of the building block processes that allowed that expertise to surface and so forth to the current day. And even looking forward, what role technology, as the congressman mentioned, could play in helping us get to a better place for both of you.
Well, I think I had a pretty, fairy tale view of what happened in Congress when, we're all going to get in there, and then we're going to go into markups, and then we're going to go into committees. And then I thought, oh, so the game is you suck up to the leader and maybe you'll get what you want. I mean, really, think about it. When you think about, and people complain about CRs and about these massive bills that get passed, and that's because the only way you can have influence on what you care about is to get your little piece of the world put into that provision, because regular order is broken. And regular order is where you make much more complex, detailed decisions on complex, detailed issues, and where you debate. And what people don't appreciate is when you don't have that debate, guess what? The public never sees why these decisions were made the way they were made. There is no public exploring or no public airing of the dialogue. And so as a result, you get decisions that that the regulated community doesn't understand. And so I think that when you think about Congress and you think about regular order, and Mel and I are involved in another process where we talk about this quite a bit, where Mel was talking about not putting that power at that level. We need to disperse power among members. We need to take the power away from leaders who are, now almost like, mob bosses. Don't tell them I said that. No, really. You come to me and I'll do you a favor, but I'm going to expect a favor back, and everybody wonders why everything's gotten so partisan. And I would tell you that I would much prefer, as a member of Congress, a member of the Senate, to basically vote on these amendments, to actually have a dialogue. I'm going to be accountable for it anyway. And so that's one thing that we really are having a discussion about. And when we talked about it in our task force, in our committee here, we basically said, what is the lack of capacity? And I think that's why the ranking member, the congressman's speech about, we know we need to staff up. And we need, on a bipartisan basis, to be supportive, because it's never, when you're at 20% favorability, guess what? Say, I need a couple $1 million more to do my job. People go, no, you don't, because you're not doing your job to begin with. And so we need to build the expertise back up and the resources back up of Congress to do their job.
Senator.
So it isn't just about the mob bosses, if you will, and I won't associate myself with that comment. But it is the leadership that ultimately makes the decisions. I can remember so many times a few of us going off to dinner as we waited for the decision to be made of what we were going to be voting on.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And so you come back from the dinner break and you find out, here's the bill, and we're on our way to vote. And so I remember when I first got to the Senate, this quaint notion that I learned in civics, Margaret, when I was doing my homework, that there would be a conference committee when the House passed, the Senate passed. I sat on one conference committee, and it was really quite quaint. and most of the time, these issues just get resolved by the leadership, basically, the speaker, the majority leader, whoever, and they just come back with a solution. That's not right. That's not the way it was meant to be. And part of that process is what is wrong with not creating the kind of bipartisan work that has to take place for there to be a successful Congress.
I just want to say, I sat on one conference committee, and I was really excited. I thought we're going to debate this difference. And I got there and I realized, oh, this is just a photo op for all of us to say we were on a conference committee. This really isn't about resolving disputes about the bills.
No, whenever the disruption in the Senate got really bad, someone would holler from the back of the floor, regular order. And regular order was just called for in a moment of crisis on the floor. It was never really part of the process. And what we need to go back to is regular order.
Okay,
That is so
so
essential.
how do we do that? How do we get from here to there when
Well-
power is concentrated, obviously? Is there going to be a uprising or?
No, I do think it begins by rebuilding the capacity of the Congress to do their work. And so that's why what the Congress was talking about, what Heidi has talked about, is so important, is that we beef up the opportunity for the Congress to have the capacity to do it. And if they have the capacity to then, it will encourage for the members to then also be able to participate in the process as part of that. And so I would hope that part of it is that. I don't think the leaders necessarily want all the power concentrated on them. Some might, but most of them really don't. And what they want is for there to be a process that works properly and that they have some partisan control over it. Yeah. And I think that's the problem at the end of the day, is that we need to go back to more bipartisanship. It is the only way that things really get resolved in the Senate anyway.
Yep.
I mean, there's no way around it.
Yeah.
So I will tell you, when we started this process and we anticipated this decision, I think it was clear. We thought there's a big reset button, that big, Staples button, and now all of a sudden this is a real opportunity to bring it back. Well, now we're in a completely different environment of executive orders, of the challenge between the executive and the legislative really on steroids. And I think that one of the things that's great about the bipartisan policy work that happens here is that we can step away from all of the swirl of today and really imagine what it should look like and be prepared when that opportunity presents itself to actually come up with ideas on what works and what doesn't. And so this was, the Loper decision was a reset that ended up happening at a time of chaos. And so one of the goals that we should have, those of us who are on this commission, those of us who believe that Congress needs to assert its authority, is to not let this report sit on the shelf, to really push people, because I know there's a lot of people out there who are deeply concerned about the imbalance of power and desperately want Article 1 to assert its Article 1 responsibilities.
We take that as a great challenge and appreciate your endorsement. I want to talk about the role of the regulator.
Okay.
Because obviously what does this decision mean for that part of the apparatus, and how might regulators?
I think regulators always want to regulate. That's what they do. And so I don't think they'll step back unless you're forced to.
Except with respect to a philosophical orientation. You talk about the trickle down. I mean,
Well, and that will continue to be the case, because I think there's always this provincial attitude that this is what I do, this is what our department does, this is what HUD does, if you will, back to my old days, and so we're going to want to regulate. But I think that's where the importance of the BPC comes in. The Bipartisan Policy Center comes up with a solution, crafted bipartisanly, that then allows the legislative branch to look at it and say, okay, is this doable? This is what we can do. And so I think the regulatory state is always going to want to drift back to what they do. And I think it's going to be forced upon them judicially and by the acts of the Congress in order for them to recognize that it's a different day.
Senator, I know you worked with Rob Portman on these issues. Talk a little bit about that and what is left to be done.
Well, I mean, I still have the scars. Anthony can attest. Being a Democrat, I would tell members of my caucus who were irritated by the fact that I was talking about cost-benefit analysis, that I was talking about, kind of reducing the amount of unnecessary regulation. And I would say, okay, let's put on our political hat. If the Democratic Party continues to be the party of irrational regulation, where the cost greatly exceeds the benefit of that regulation, you'll be a minority party for a long time. And so you need to recalibrate your thinking. Howard Shalansky, who's part of this effort, and I did a lot of work, he was at OIRA at the time, and the example that he gave that I think might have come from Cass Sunstein, who also ran OIRA, it was, look, if everybody traveled 15 miles an hour on the freeway, you would not have a freeway death. I mean, you have fender benders or whatever. But we don't do that because we're willing to assume some risk. And so you can't regulate a risk-free world. And I think going back to how regulators look at it, they need now to be perfect, because if something slips through the cracks, they're going to get blamed for a crisis or for an outbreak of whatever might come. And so the thing is to recalibrate our risk tolerance. And that's really what Rob and I did, was trying to think about where is the right balance. And we did a lot of negotiation. I think we came up with a really good bill. But let me tell you, most of the constituency groups that I dealt with on the Democratic side didn't like me very much when we were doing that work, because it seemed to imply, an over-regulation, or they were afraid that it would go too far. And so I think that we all need to appreciate that we make decisions every day in a balance. And where that balance is going to depend, but we need to set some guardrails on terms of what's too much or what's too little. And I think that's really what we're talking about here, building the capacity of Congress to understand what those guardrails are, communicate those guardrails, and to tell people. I mean, I always say, regulation, here's a great example. When we were talking about cryptocurrency and banking, people said they're all talking about how they're going to regulate it. And when it got to me, and I was new, I said, why are you regulating anything? Buyer beware. And then it was like a shock, that anyone would say that Congress didn't have a role. And I said, look, you don't know enough about it to regulate it. And I think that those questions need to be asked all the time. Why are you doing this? And what assumption of risk do you expect the public to take as it relates to what we're doing in America? And if you think you're regulating a risk-free world, you will never be successful, and you will cost way more money than what you ever benefit as a result of that regulation.
Amen.
And that's what
Yeah.
that's what Rob and I talked about.
Okay, I'm going to give you the last word because I know you're involved in the, the Senate reform kind of more broadly. Why don't we talk about that for a second?
Well, the idea is that some of us were called together, Heidi and I, a bipartisan group, 10 senators, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and the idea was, what do we need to do to make the Senate work better, to actually perform the functions that the Senate has historically been called to perform. And so the idea is to come back and make a set of proposals, and we're close to having a final product, not as efficiently as the BPC would have done.
We had good leadership.
But anyway, no, the process is to come back with some recommendations on how to fix the filibuster, not do away with it, but how to make it more modern, more workable in a way that can function in the current environment, but yet maintain the Senate what the Senate is. And so a set of rules that would allow the Senate to go back to who we are as a Senate, not become another version of the House of Representatives, but to recognize that there's a need for modernization, more bipartisanship, and going back to first principles. So a little bit of what the work we're doing here is recommending, which is do your work, do your job, and the only way you can do your job is if you make some adjustments to Senate rules, which are unique in and of themselves. Only the Senate knows what Senate rules are. And so in any event, it's exciting work, and I hope that we'll have a product that will help the Senate in the future to go back to being the greatest deliberative body in the history of the world, which is a fairly lofty title to have given ourselves.
Yes.
But we might live up to it if we follow some
Yeah.
of what we're suggesting.
We look forward to seeing that and to working with you. All right. Well, let's give our fantastic senators a round of applause here. And I now want to call on Matthew Schwartz, who will lead our panel discussion. He has a lot to work with between the congressman and these two senators. So, Matthew, off to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Matthew Schwartz. I am a senior audio producer at Bloomberg Law. Senior audio producer at Bloomberg Law and host of the podcast Uncommon Law, which does deep dives on important legal issues. Our current season is about, we're calling it the rise and fall of agency power. So if you want to learn all about the history of the Chevron doctrine and Loper Bright, and you want to hear audio of me climbing up the side of a herring vessel as I'm talking to the Loper Bright plaintiffs, that's coming out soon. Get it wherever you get your podcasts, Uncommon Law. I'm going to invite the panelists on stage. We've got Kurt Couchman, a senior policy fellow for fiscal policy for Americans for Prosperity. Marcy Harris, co-founder and executive director of PopVox Foundation. Victoria Nurse, a professor at Georgetown Law. Jeffrey Rosen, non-resident fellow for AEI and former acting U.S. Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General. Thank you all for joining us. We've got 25 minutes to fix Congress. Actually, it looks like we've got a little bit longer than that. So quickly, reactions to those remarks and comments we've just heard. This is a lightning round. I'm going to go down the line. What did you take away from what we just heard? Your big takeaways.
Well, we have a system of checks and balances, and the court has shifted from what I would consider a policy of judicial abdication to a policy of judicial engagement that really puts it back on Congress to clarify what the law is so the agencies can regulate according to that. All regulations ultimately flow from congressional laws. And the court has said that we're going to make sure that the agency actions are consistent with what Congress has enacted.
All right, thank you.
So before the Loper Bright decision came out, our team got together and I said, whatever they say, we're going to say it means that you need to increase congressional capacity. But I will tell you that without any kind of stretch, what it says is that we need to increase congressional capacity. I very strongly associate myself with the remarks of Representative Morelli, who's been such a champion, along with Chair Stile. I think that what we're seeing not only requires beefing up congressional capacity in terms of personnel, but also, as has been mentioned a few times, technology means, and the growth of AI means, not only that there are new tools available, but also that Congress is going to have to act more agilely and responsively to lots of issues that are coming up, not just the issues that are coming from the courts. So to the question of can Congress do this, Congress doesn't have a choice. Our society is going to change so quickly over the next decade, and we have to have a responsive Congress, expertise in the committees, and the ability to act.
Thank you. Professor Nurse.
Well, I agree. Yes, yes. I spend most of my life teaching about statutory interpretation, and my phone has been ringing off the hook since Loper Bright. I have impersonated Justice Scalia for 30 years in the classroom, and I really love these issues. But since Loper Bright, I've been getting questions about how to draft. Senator Peters calls me and says, how do we draft an AI bill? We don't even know what AI will do. And so I think this is a wake-up call. And having spent a little bit of my time in Congress when I was 29 years old for a guy named Biden, and spending more time negotiating with Thurman and Hatch than I did with him, I will say this is a very important report, and I'm delighted to be invited here.
Thank you. Mr. Rosen.
So I thought it was a terrific discussion and a illuminating report. There's been a lot of conversation about the institutional resources, and I understand why that's a focus. But I have to say, part of what interested me were some of the other aspects that haven't got as much airtime today, such as the incentives and maybe even the rules. So there was a proposal in the report to, I'm going to oversimplify, but I think it was to fast track certain reauthorizations that met certain criteria as having responded to the Loper Bright need for clarity. I thought, like, that's actually quite interesting to me. And I think, not in the report, but can the rules be tinkered with? Can it be that the Rules Committee is not letting you get a floor vote unless people are satisfied that all delegations have been specified, clarified, and non-delegations clarified? And so I think some emphasis on the incentives and the rules is important, in addition to the discussion we've heard a lot of today about the institutional capacity.
Will it be possible to change the rules? It's a nice idea. How do we do it?
How to change the rules? Well, that's obviously up to the members.
Do you think it's possible in the current atmosphere?
Well, you know, we should have asked that question of the senators and the House member. But I think when it comes to something that it doesn't really have big partisan valence, I don't know why not. In other words, it's just changing the way in which the legislation is drafted to provide the specificity and clarity of Congress's own prerogatives. I don't know why that's not in everyone's interest.
I love your optimism. It reminds me of where I learned about how Congress works, which was, of course, Schoolhouse Rock. I'm just a bill. With the later update in The Simpsons, I'm an amendment to be, which was an excellent follow-up. But I do think we might need another update to that because it doesn't seem to work that way anymore. Marcy, we've just heard that Congress needs to say what it means. We hear a lot about dysfunction in Congress. Can Congress say what it means? Does it know what it means? Can Congress change?
So again, yes, it has to, but I think the question of can Congress say what it means is a big one, because often at the table, everyone might be agreeing on the language but meaning a very different thing from their seat. I see some nods from the senators. So I think that's where we see the issues, and the reason that the question of whether Congress needs to get specific, I think is something that we can really clarify, because I actually think that the point is clarity about delegation, not specificity in the details of the legislation. And I really think, again, back to the need for Congress to deal with a rapidly changing society, focusing on outcomes, focusing on intent, focusing on the goals of legislation, and allowing for flexibility at the implementation stage, even a little federalism, so some flexibility down in the states when that's the implementation mechanism. I think it actually is an opportunity for Congress to do things differently in a way that is more responsive to the current world.
Just to follow up, you talked about the need to increase congressional capacity. We heard Congressman Morelli say that Loper Bright sidelines subject matter expertise at the agency. Does increasing capacity in Congress just mean the need to shift that expertise to Congress?
So I think what is really interesting, and I had this conversation with former legislative counsel of the House, Wade Ballou, who I know you consulted with on the report, and we were talking about the fact that if the courts are going to be digging in to try to figure out congressional intent, they cannot ignore legislative history. And so that means, I think, that the building of the record within Congress, whether it's the committee reports or even additional hearing time and statements on the record, become important for the actual eventual process that the courts will go through to interpret what Congress intended. And I think that really is something that we can beef up within both of the chambers.
Forgive me, it's been decades since I went to law school, but I don't remember the courts loving legislative
They don't love
history.
it, but if they're going to have to get into the minds of Congress, things like what is otherwise considered dicta for this court, whether it's a finding statement or an outcome or a goals statement, et cetera, within the legislation, you can't have both. You can't have, we're going to completely defer to Congress, but we're not going to look at what they said at the time that they were passing the law.
Professor Nurse, I'm going to go to you. The report mentioned, I thought this was very interesting, it mentioned three main reasons why congressional committees build in ambiguity into a law. One was in order to kind of make it a little squishy to get bipartisan support and be able to compromise. Number two was it was unintentional. They just didn't really know what was going to be facing a changing industry. And number three, intentional, to give agencies the power to regulate within the gaps, because they've all been legislating in a world where Chevron is the reality, and it's not anymore. So now, what can Congress do, since they can't just be intentionally ambiguous or silent on things? How hard is it going to be to offer catch-all language and still get bipartisan support and still pass muster with the courts, who are going to be determining what necessary and reasonable means,
Yeah, well, so Loper Bright really recalibrated not only the relationship between the court and the executive, but the court and Congress. Congress has the Article I power. It is Article I, after all, not Article III, to take and provide default rules. They can have legislative canons. So the court has created hundreds of canons in the last 20 years. Textualism has been around for purposivism. You can't even use the word purpose in a Supreme Court brief today. And legislative history has to be sprinkled through your briefs. I do think there's a role for statutory history, which is a new concept, but I do think there's so much you could do with the Legislative Counsel's office to bring them up to date. It's clear from the code they provide that they have not been reading the Supreme Court cases. It's clear that they could do a lot more with default rules. Congress has that power to say in any particular statute, and this report indicates that. This statute shall be, interpreted in light of the fact that AI has unknown capacity, and therefore, in light of the harms that Congress seeks to prevent. Something like that. I mean, that's very broad, but the default rules can be linked to the founding. There used to be a remedial, canon of construction. And that can be added to any particular statute, but the Legislative Counsel's Office has to be aware of that. Right now, they're teaching 1930s law review articles about canons, canon, counter canon. And although that does happen, this happens, they have to be brought up to date, and that's not hard. I mean, I wish we had, Justice Scalia had created ACUS, or helped create ACUS, which I'm on, the Administrative Council of the United States. We need ELCUS, Legislative Council of the United States, which is a part of a kind of people like me who, do this, for, not that many big bucks, who just love it. We volunteer over at ACUS. There should be some volunteer work here in the interim before you build capacity. Sorry for that.
You mentioned legislative history. You mentioned statutory history,
Yeah.
which I'm not familiar with. Could you briefly define that?
Yeah, in a case called Bostock, which applied Title VII to sexual orientation, the dissenting justices, Alito and Kavanaugh, relied on what they sometimes call a statutory history, what happened in Congress, and they have to do that. Increasingly, the court has put the window on small words. So in one case, Justice Barrett, and I just use this, I've debated her, she's a lovely woman. She spent 8 paragraphs on the word so in a statute. And the pinch, my colleague calls it the hermeneutical pinch, the interpretive pinch, you just don't have enough information. So they end up going to the congressional materials anyway, and Congress could really help by organizing those materials, providing, Congress.gov does a pretty good job, but they could beef that up in any particular legislative case to have a bipartisan or nonpartisan report on what the materials are, which would also be helpful because it will show the compromises that have been taken. And that's exactly why Justice Scalia was a textualist, because he believed that statutes, as we all know, why was I standing out with more with Senator Thurman's staff than Senator Biden's staff? Well, that's because it's all about compromise. Getting to 60 in the Senate is a definition of legislation today. Sorry for the long spiel.
Mr. Couchman, you've written a great deal about reforms to Congress that will help bring back what some call regular order, which we've heard that term thrown out today. I'm not sure exactly what that means. I don't know if we're going to try to make Congress great again, or when regular order existed. What is it? Can you talk about it? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to revive?
Well, there's a lot of different ideas about what that means. If you talk to the 10 members of the working group and the staff, the BPC staff has been absolutely fantastic throughout this process. You'd probably have twice as many ideas about what regular order is than the number of people involved. But the way that I think about it is that it is applying a rule of law process to the deliberations that Congress goes through in making policy and enacting statutes. And it's to give you a predictable cadence so that members and staff can get read up on the issues and decide whether and how to engage. Sometimes it's on the committees you're in, sometimes it's working with a friend or a partner, an ally on another committee, so that the most ideas possible can come to bear on an issue that is before the body, and that by assembling all this information together, hopefully you get the best possible outcomes from that. I don't know that there is a return to regular order so much as a need to create one that is suitable for the Congress that we have, the society that we have. One of the things that we talked about a lot in the working group was the authorization side, or the programmatic statutes that ultimately often give rise to regulations. But that is hard to do when you don't have a sense as to how the different trade-offs between areas of federal activities stack up. And so we also have a problem with our budget process. We don't have a regular order budget process. Appropriations are really important, but they're a quarter of spending these days. And reconciliation, which is the current hot topic, and we're all for a good result from that, that covers on-budget direct spending, revenue, and tax expenditures. It doesn't touch appropriations, it doesn't touch Social Security, doesn't really look at the net interest or the debt. And so if we don't have a comprehensive budget process that helps Congress look across all these different areas and try to see where more value can be provided for the American people, then that limits the amount of attention that Congress can give to the authorizing side as well. So it's an iterative process that goes back and forth. In my mind, a really key part of the regular order that we need is for the committees to be the areas of expertise, and there's technical expertise about the subject matter that they have jurisdiction over, but there's also expertise that for Congress is really important in terms of the different values, the different interests across our great country. And one of the things that I thought former Speaker Kevin McCarthy was really interesting about is he talked about how every committee should ideally be a microcosm of the conference. And that's not just, in terms of ideology or geography, but the more you can have each committee be essentially a representative sample of Congress, you're getting closer to a representative sample of the people, and that means that you can strike deals and make agreements that are more representative of what is good for America and provides value for the people.
You mentioned the need for committees to increase their expertise. How?
Well, the Committee on House Administration provides the budgets, but it is partly, there are constraints that members of Congress feel politically with respect to funding their own capacity. And I think the capacity work is really important, but Congress is one of the most professionalized, if not the most professionalized legislatures in the country. We work with a bunch of states on policy as well. It's full-time, incredible information, incredible staff. But what it is really short on is incentives and opportunity. And the senators mentioned some areas to help expand some of those things as well.
I'm just looking for specifics, like if they have more resources, who are they hiring?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, if they can hire more people, then that would help, but they also have to be able to use those people to do the good public interest work. I worked in House offices and the personal offices. There's been a big shift from legislative staff to communication staff and casework staff because that is where the political juice is, not so much on the policy side. So if you fix the incentives, then the existing resources will shift in the directions where they can be more valuable for policy development. But yeah, of course, Congress should spend more on itself when it makes sense to do. But when you have ledge branch appropriations, which is $7 billion, which is a tiny, tiny share even of discretionary spending and an even smaller share of the overall budget, then you have members saying, oh, we can't raise our pay and we can't expand our own congressional staff capacity. So if you were to move to a more holistic budget, then you would have some of the political cover from voting in the context of defense and healthcare and all the things that are popular and you can message on more and sort of counter on, oh, well, we had to increase our congressional capacity, but you're sort of not exposed on that particular issue.
And just very quickly, in your experience, in your mind, when is the last time Congress had regular order? What decade are we in? What era are we in?
I think Congress has always been fairly ad hoc until it got to the size where that wasn't sustainable anymore. And then you had a real concentration of power and leadership. Joe Cannon is the famous example that there was a revolution among moderate Republicans and Democrats that reduced his power quite a bit on St. Patrick's Day in 1910, I believe, or 1913. And then it shifted more towards committee empowerment, where the committees were essentially fiefdoms within their jurisdiction, and now the pendulum has swung back. It was swinging back in the 70s and 80s, really culminated with Speaker Gingrich taking office after the '94 wave, and it sort of continued to escalate from there. But there's a lot of interest in rebalancing so that the policy process is more driven by the committees with their relative expertise.
All right. Mr. Rosen, you've been sitting here so patiently. I want to talk to you about the regulatory pendulum. You wrote an article for National Affairs last year describing the oscillation between presidential administrations regarding executive branch actions. Can you tell us more about the phenomenon and what you've observed since you wrote it?
Yeah. So there have been lots and lots of attention, justified actually, as to the continually growing administrative state in terms of the number of regulations and the cost of regulations. And that's been, over the long haul, a growing thing. But there had been less attention, and this is what my article focused more on, to the growing phenomenon over time of a new administration revoking the actions of a prior administration, the executive orders, the regulations, and other executive actions of the other party. So this was growing slowly. If we look at executive orders being revoked as opposed to all the new ones that were accreting, this was growing slowly. So President Bush undid 6 of his successors. President Obama undid 8. So it was a little growth, 25% growth, but small numbers, 6 to 8. President Trump undid 9 of President Obama's, and I'm talking about actually in the first 6 months. And then some acceleration. President Biden in 2021 undid 34 executive orders of President Trump. And a Brookings tracker said that literally half of Biden's executive actions in his first year were undoing of Trump rules. So this phenomenon then of an administration comes in and it doesn't just do its new policy initiatives, it undoes its predecessors, is what I was focused on, because we don't actually have a parliamentary system. But in the executive branch, you can both do what you want to do and you can undo your predecessors, and that creates some instability. And who can do that differently? Well, Congress, because Congress's actions have durability, in part because what I just said, it's not a parliamentary system. It's a system that needs 60 votes in the Senate, and legislation is deliberately hard to achieve, but also hard to undo. And so,
How many actions has President Trump undone since he's been in office?
yeah, I left that out. I'm glad you got to that. I predicted in the article that when there was a change of parties in the presidency, because the article was before last year's election, we would see an even bigger acceleration. So whereas President Biden had undone 34 executive orders of President Trump, Trump in the first day undid 78 of Biden's, and he's now up around 100. And that's just executive orders. Lots of these regulations now tend to become the oscillation, the pendulum I was referring to of, like net neutrality. President Obama's FCC put it in, President Trump's took it out, President Biden's put it in. It's going to come back out. And so we see the policy goes back and forth with no legislation. Congress had no say.
How much of a broad principle, though, can you draw from just the example of President Trump, who seems to be an outlier in terms of his desire to undo what previous administrations did? Like, I can understand why after Biden came back, or after Biden became president, he might now undo 36 and then Trump would undo 78. Do you think that this is going to continue, or is this just an outlier?
No, I think it will continue unless Congress chooses to exercise its authority. Congress can make things durable, because legislation, as I say, it's both hard to enact, but it's also hard to repeal. And this does square with what we're talking about on Loper Bright, because one of the rationales that the Supreme Court talked about in Loper Bright was that under Chevron deference, the executive branch got deference for its interpretations, including changed ones. So if one administration said the law means this and we can do a regulation accordingly, the next one came in and said, no, it's the opposite, they both got deference. But now there's, under Loper Bright, only one right answer, which is the thing is to be interpreted in the best and most appropriate way, and the executive branch can't just put it on the pendulum and swing back and forth as to ambiguities. It has plenty of remaining authority, but at least as to ambiguities. So the real question is, so if we want things to have greater stability and durability, and by the way, the other advantage of Congress doing things is Congress is not a monolith. The executive branch, one side at a time, controls it. There's a Democratic president or a Republican president, winner take all. But in Congress, by its very nature, there's something for everyone. There's some compromise necessary, at least most of the time. Reconciliation may be a little different, but most of the time, so that even the minority continues to have a say, and that too improves durability and stability. So it reinforces, I think, the discussion we're having about the importance of Congress both specifying and clarifying what authority it wants agencies to have or not have, because it can say in the legislation too, you can't make rules. You can only do what we said in the statute, or it can say you can do rules on A, B, and C and not D, E, and F, whatever. But the importance of Congress reasserting itself in the authority that the executive branch would thereafter have, I think is a bipartisan kind of issue.
I want to stay on the question of the executive branch power versus legislative branch. One of the things we're seeing play out in real time today is a dispute regarding authority over regulatory agencies. President Trump is exerting presidential authority over them, which some prefer as the unitary executive. Some of the lawsuits brought against the administration have, in contrast, asserted that Congress's plenary authority over agencies is strong. Are these lines of authority fixed? How should we think about the roles of the legislative and the executive when it comes to this so-called fourth branch?
Oh, me.
Well, everybody,
Sure.
down the line.
I brought my little pocket constitution as well worn at this point, but when you read Article 2, Section 1, it says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. That seems pretty unitary to me, although I am the only non-lawyer on this panel, so you guys can talk about that some more. But, you know, we've got a constitution, statutes need to be within that, and then the agency actions need to be within the bounds of the statute. And if there are challenges, as we are currently seeing, then the court's job since Marbury is to say what the law is, and especially reinforced by Loper Bright. And if there's a clash between the executive branch and the judicial branch, then it might be that Congress needs to step up and figure out how to be its own reassertion, how to reinvigorate itself, and be a more active player in the checks and balances with respect to the executive. But only Congress can revive itself. Congress can write laws having to do with the rest of the government, but Congress writes the rules for its own proceedings, and so it's really up to Congress to fix itself so that it can play the role it's supposed to play.
We've got a few more questions to get through and not much time. So does anybody else have a strong thought to that?
Go ahead. Well, I just want to say, the problem with asking Congress to do things is that since 1990, when I worked there, we've had a constant filibuster. And so that means a minority can block any particular legislation that's not budgetary. This is why President Biden ruled by reconciliation, and you're going to see the same in return. So that is the problem with saying Congress, and I was delighted to hear that Senator Martinez and others are working on reforming, not getting rid of it. But the unitary executive is being pushed, in my view, by this president to do things that Congress has done since 1789. The first months, I've just been reading the first Congress, and they created the Department of Foreign Affairs, and they created the Department of State, they created the Department of War. They create the entities. A president cannot get rid of an agency, and President Trump has indicated he agrees with that with regard to the Department of Education. We're going to see a huge Supreme Court case involving independent, multi-member agencies. Because the problem with the unitary executive as giving a prerogative power of removal, which is what the immunity decision says, is that it is the power to destroy multi-member boards. And that includes the Federal Reserve and the FDIC. My father was a banker, I get to say this stuff. And so people should beware about claims about the fourth branch, because these are things Congress has created for the last 100 years since the late 19th century. There are some examples of the founding, but we're pushing the envelope here, and the court is going to play a huge role in trying to determine whether those multi-member boards continue.
I want to bring it back to Loper Bright for a moment. From the agency perspective, now that Chevron deference is gone, how do you think agencies will approach the interpretation of statutory text going forward? Who wants to take this one?
So I'm happy to posit that right now I think we see a massive reinterpretation happening in the agencies, and we're going to see what it looks like when those new interpretations crash up against the shore of Loper Bright. And so I think we're seeing, you know, a lot of interesting changes happening. They aren't in the courts yet; they will be, and that's when I think there is the potential for the executive branch to realize that there's a legislative branch that they might want to go talk to, And that's where a trifecta might open the opportunity for Congress to consider some of the reforms that were just mentioned of the rules for a more rapid consideration of perhaps clarifications or reinterpretations of existing statutes that the agencies are interpreting.
Mr. Rosen?
Well, I'll just embellish. I think it's going to have a salutary effect because the role of the agency, instead of being, do we have a reasonable interpretation that supports our own preferred approach to the statute, now has to be, what's the best and most correct interpretation of what the law was intended to accomplish? What did Congress say and the president sign? And that will make the role for agency lawyers a little bit more like judges, having to apply the tools of statutory interpretation to predict what a court's going to say is the best interpretation. But I think that gets us closer to what the Congress and the president who signs the bill were intending, rather than treating everything as a delegation of new authority to agencies.
I have a final question. We've got a few minutes left. Some observers looking at what's happening in our country are alarmed. We've got Loper Bright that eliminated agency deference. We've got plenty of other recent court cases that have reduced agency power. You've got a president that's gutting agencies, firing staff, in the process reducing what agency expertise that we did have even more. Should we be alarmed? Will Congress step up, and what happens if they don't? I'll go down the line.
There's the Chinese proverb that chaos is opportunity, riding on dangerous winds. And I feel like we're in that kind of a moment right now where things have not really changed that much institutionally for several generations now. But between the work of outside reformers and reformers within Congress and the increasing demand of members of Congress to be relevant, for their ideas to matter, we're poised for a period of great transformation. So yeah, there are some things that we should be cautious about, but it's also an incredible opportunity to get Congress and the federal government really serving the American people in a much better way than it has been.
Ms. Harris?
My first public service experience was after my town got hit by a tornado. And it has kind of been a point of reference for me ever since, that in times of great turmoil, as was just described, there is an opportunity to rethink and to rebuild and to think about how things should work. And I think right now, it is not just Loper Bright. It is a rapidly changing society. There are many questions that we need to re-examine to think about how a government should run in the 21st century. And I think that right now we have a real opportunity to dig deep and think about what that should look like.
Professor Nurse?
Yeah, I think we have some existential challenges, and so the legislature has to step up. And the way that's going to happen is that the people are going to have to step up, because that's the incentive. Mr. Rosen and I were talking about incentives, and the truest word about politics, it's all local. And so when people are angry because things aren't working, they don't perhaps like all of these executive orders, that's going to spur people to take a new look at some of their old practices. And so I think this is a great time for people to be involved in reform.
Mr. Rosen?
I think I largely echo what I take to be the whole panel sentiment, that it's a time of opportunity. Opportunity always comes with some uncertainty and some challenges as to what the outcomes will prove to be, but I think the right way to look at it is to think of it as a great opportunity.
Thank you so much, everybody. Excellent.
Thank you.
If you want to learn more about Loper Bright and the future of agency and congressional power, you can listen to Uncommon Law wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, everybody. I want to recognize Dane Stangler, who was the
Thanks.
captain
Yes,
of
thank
the
you,
ship.
Dane.
You kept it moving at a good clip.
Great job, and check out our report online at the bipartisanpolicycenter.org. And thank you, panel.
Thank you.
The end.
Thank you.